Aloha everybody, this is Bordessa from livewithukulele.com, and in this video I wanted to share a couple of tips that I've been working on a lot with my students for how to hold chords easier. Sometimes you play a chord and it just sounds terrible. You can't get the notes to ring through, or there's buzz or something happening. So I've been really emphasizing this with my students, is just learning how to position your fingers in an efficient way. Because just pressing down harder is not always the answer, because you might be wasting a lot of energy pushing down in a place that you don't really need to be pushing down on. So here are a couple tips to hopefully make your chord playing easier. The first one is make sure that when you're playing a chord, your finger sits in the middle of the fret, or a little bit above the middle of the fret. This may seem super obvious, but I see people holding chords, and because they're trying to smash a bunch of fingers into the same fret, they're not turning their wrist enough or something. They've got some fingers that are way far back in the fret and some fingers that are high up in the fret. And the ones that are too far back are usually the ones, provided there's not another finger blocking them, are the ones that buzz. Because you have to push down harder just the way the string sits in the fret. It takes more effort to push down in the back of the fret than in the front of the fret. You can play around with, just start like with your finger directly on a fret, and you can just slowly move it up and kind of start to see where the golden zone is, because you can come way far up before the string starts to get muted again. So now I've gone from on top of one fret to kind of on top of the next fret, and you have more workable room kind of on this side of the middle of the fret. If you see a lot of guys, if you really pay attention to some guys who are like really good, know their stuff, especially on guitar, because you've got wider frets towards the headstock, but you'll actually see they're not playing right in the middle, they're playing a little bit above the middle, kind of closer to the fret, and that gives you kind of the easiest place to push down and still the best sound. So play around with that. If you're playing a chord and you don't have any other fingers blocking the strings, but you're still not getting a clear sound, try and look at where your fingers are at inside the fret. A lot of times I'll just take a student's finger and just push it up like a couple millimeters on the fret, and it's like they get a clear sound because their finger has gone from here to there with the same amount of pressure pushing down. And it's just a matter of knowing where your efficiency is. Second tip is make sure you don't have other fingers covering other fingers, which should be pretty straightforward, but sometimes it's not if you're playing a hard chord. Always, when you're playing a chord, the highest finger on any string is the one you're going to hear, unless there's a finger blocking it. So, when you have a chord, like say G, we'll use a G major chord as an example, your first finger on the second fret of the C string can lay down as much as it wants, because above it, on the two lower strings, are two fingers holding notes higher than where this finger is coming across. So you can have this finger can be lazy and it can touch these strings and would otherwise make them buzz, but they're not going to buzz because you have fingers higher than that. Whereas if you have your third finger and your third finger is laying down, there's a finger that's trying to make a note below that. So you'd be you're blocking something out if you try and lay this finger down. So you need to make sure that your fingers, or at least the important fingers that might be blocking out other notes, are pressing pretty much directly straight down on the strings. Because if they're not and they're sideways, then you're gonna start losing notes. But when you're doing this, one of kind of the easiest ways to get your fingers at a more extreme angle, going straight towards the fretboard, is instead of having your thumb up, this is like no-brainer, Ukulele 101, but you always want to have your thumb more on the back of the neck, like the top half of the back of the neck, kind of behind your first or second finger, wherever they turn out to be. So kind of like this is a good rule of thumb for where you want your thumb to be. And then from there, if that's still not enough, because what you're doing when you're doing that is you're taking your hand from being here, and a lot of extra movement in your hand is wasted holding the ukulele in the crook between your thumb and your finger, to all of a sudden you've got more room and you can bring your wrist out a little bit more without it being like a stretch. So if you have your thumb on the back of the neck, you can bring your wrist out a little bit further. And so if that's not enough to get your fingers straight down on the strings, then what you can do is you can bring your elbow out a little bit, and if you're just bringing your wrist forward a little bit, and you don't want to be like this, that's bad. If you're having to do that, you're doing something wrong. But if you need just a little bit more to clear the strings, you can try bringing your elbow out just a little bit, and then your wrist forward a little bit, and that should give you enough angle. And if that's not enough, then you should start looking at where your fingers are bending, and if you've got some fingers that are just not cooperating, and you need to focus on getting the knuckles working in the right direction. Last tip is something I picked up from Roy Sakuma. Actually, I went to a ukulele workshop from him a while back, and it turned out to be super basic, which was not super exciting for me, but it was good because I got to see his teaching style, and I picked up this trick which I've been using with people, and it seems to really help. So props to Roy Sakuma for figuring this out. But especially for chords where you're playing heavily on the bottom strings and you're having a hard time getting enough leverage to push down, like say a B flat. Everybody struggles with B flat at first. So, you know, providing you have the proper angles of your fingers pressing straight down like we were just talking about, sometimes this bar on the bottom two strings first fret can be a struggle. But what Roy said is, if you think about holding the chord, instead of squeezing with your fingers, which kind of gives you a different sort of action, think about pushing away with your thumb, and it almost automatically rolls your wrist into the chord, and it helps you get that power right on your index finger, and it seems to really help. So when in doubt with the B flat or any kind of chord where you're really working the lower strings, especially with a bar or something, like, you know, maybe a G major 7, something along those lines, instead of thinking squeeze with your finger, which can leave some spots kind of unattended for, if you think push away with your thumb, sometimes that will help ratchet everything down and get you a clean sounding chord. So hopefully that's helpful. Always remember, there's no substitute for practice. The more you do something, the better you get. Bottom line, as long as you're moving forwards and you're making sure you have the right technique as you go forwards with your practice, you should be in good shape. Just always remember to really look at what you're doing, and if you've got a problem, figure out why you have a problem. Don't just try and fix it, try and figure out why. So then you can really look at the root of it and figure out what the problem is, and you might be able to use the solution in more places than just that one chord. So always pay attention when you're playing. So until next time, aloha.